My name is Anne. I am 23 years old and I've lived in Portland for as long as I can remember. I lead a quiet, simple life, maybe even too quiet for someone my age. I work at a small bookstore downtown, and most evenings I head straight home with a bag of groceries or something easy to cook. I'm not much of a social butterfly. I keep to myself, find comfort in routine, and rarely deviate from the expected. It's not that I fear the unknown, I just never saw a reason to chase it. That Thursday evening felt no different from the dozens that came before it. I remember the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that don't quite rain but make you carry an umbrella anyway. I stopped at the corner market on my way home, my mind still spinning with thoughts of inventory counts and whether I remembered to unplug the coffee maker. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. I was standing in the checkout line, distracted, staring at a magazine cover with some headline about a celebrity divorce, when I noticed an elderly man 2 customers behind me. He was staring. Not the usual distracted glance of someone waiting their turn, but an intense, deliberate gaze. When I met his eyes, he smiled gently and took a step closer. "You look so much like my granddaughter," he said, voice weathered but steady. I gave him a polite smile and nodded, assuming it was just a harmless comment. But then he added, with a hint of hesitation, "My daughter gave her up for adoption 23 years ago." The air shifted. I felt my breath catch in my throat. A strange chill crawled down my spine. Still, I tried to maintain composure, forcing a polite curiosity into my voice as I asked, "What was her name?" The man looked straight at me, his eyes glassy but certain. "Anne Shaw." The name hit me like a punch to the chest. My hands went numb. The bag of groceries slipped from my arms and scattered across the tile floor, apples rolling, a loaf of bread tumbling sideways, a bottle of orange juice landing with a thud. People around us murmured, some bent to help, but I barely registered any of it. My world narrowed to that name, those 2 words that suddenly echoed louder than anything else around me. Anne Shaw. My name. My full name. The old man watched me, clearly noting my reaction. I could see a tremor in his jaw, something between hope and heartbreak. He didn't say anything else. Just turned and slowly walked out of the store, disappearing into the misty Portland evening like a ghost with unfinished business. I stood there in a daze, my heart pounding. My name. He had said my name. In the hours that followed, I couldn't shake it. I kept trying to rationalize it, a coincidence, a misunderstanding. Maybe I had heard wrong. Maybe he was confused. But deep down, I knew better. Something inside me had shifted. Something I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. That moment in the grocery store, with fluorescent lights flickering above and strangers stepping over my spilled groceries, was the beginning. It was the crack in the surface of everything I thought I knew. I had no idea yet what it meant, or how far it would go. But one thing was certain. Nothing in my life would ever be the same again. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept replaying the encounter over and over, the man's expression, his voice, the way he said my name. Every sound in my apartment felt louder than usual. The ticking of the clock. The hum of the fridge. The rustling of the leaves outside my window. But nothing drowned out the echo of that voice in my head. By morning, I had convinced myself to return to the market. Not because I thought he would be there, honestly, I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe I was hoping to find some piece of evidence that it had all just been a strange misunderstanding. Maybe I wanted closure. Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted to believe it wasn't a coincidence. I arrived just after 9 o'clock in the morning. The store was quiet, with a few early shoppers browsing the aisles. I went straight to the checkout lane where it all happened. I scanned the floor instinctively, and that's when I saw it, a beige envelope, thick, worn at the edges, tucked beneath a display of candy bars like it had fallen and been kicked aside unnoticed. I picked it up. There was no name on the outside. No address. Just the kind of generic envelope you'd find in any office drawer. But it felt heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. I asked the cashier if anyone had returned to claim a lost item. She shrugged and said no, barely looking up from her register. I hesitated before slipping the envelope into my tote bag. I didn't know why I felt nervous, but I did. My heart was racing again, the same way it had the night before. I walked home in silence, the envelope pressed against my side like a secret whispering urgently to be opened. Back in my apartment, I locked the door, sat on the floor, and carefully peeled it open. Photographs. Black and white. Some in color. A woman holding a baby. A toddler in a high chair. A man, the same man from the store, standing in front of a large, elegant house, smiling proudly beside a Christmas tree. And then, a birth certificate. Name, and Grace Shaw. Date of birth, August 16th. Place of birth, Multnomah County, Oregon. Mother, Grace Shaw. Father, not listed. I couldn't breathe. I turned the certificate over. Paperclipped to the back was a letter. The handwriting was neat but trembled slightly, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who once had perfect cursive, but age had made the lines softer, shakier. Dear and, it began. I don't know if this will ever reach you. I've written it 100 times, rewritten it more. You were taken from our lives in silence, and I've spent every day since praying you'd return. I am your grandfather. My name is Richard Shaw. Your mother, Grace, was my only child. When she gave you up, it broke her, and it broke me. But I never stopped looking. I never stopped hoping. I read it again. And again. Each time, the words felt heavier, like they were pushing down on me, burying everything I thought I knew about myself. I wasn't adopted through some anonymous agency. I wasn't a child lost to the world. Someone had been searching for me. Someone had cared enough to write this. To carry it. To drop it, maybe by accident, maybe not, right where I would find it. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't move much. I just sat there, surrounded by photographs of people I didn't recognize, but whose faces felt hauntingly familiar. I kept staring at one in particular, a woman with long dark hair, holding a baby close to her chest. Her eyes looked like mine. There was no denying it anymore. Something inside me had opened, and it wasn't going to close. By the next morning, I was no longer questioning whether the man was confused. I knew it was him, Richard Shaw. My grandfather. The man from the letter, the photos, the memory now etched into my mind with painful clarity. But that only led to more questions. Who is Grace, really? Why had she given me away? Why had my entire life been built around silence? I needed answers. Real ones. Not just memories captured in fading photographs or words written in a trembling hand. So I did what I always do when I feel lost, I researched. I stayed home from work and sat in front of my laptop, combing through public records, obituaries, social media accounts, anything that might lead me to Richard Shaw. It didn't take long. He wasn't exactly a ghost. Richard Shaw had once been a prominent name in Portland's business world. Former CEO of a regional real estate firm, several awards, community fundraisers, charity galas, his life had been public until about 15 years ago, when he seemingly vanished from the social scene. There were whispers in the online forums and archived newspaper articles. One headline read, "Tycoon vanishes after family tragedy." Another, "Richard Shaw sells company, withdraws from public life." Then I found it. Resident list, North Pines Assisted Living Facility. His name. Richard Shaw. Age, 82. My pulse jumped. North Pines was a high-end nursing home nestled just outside the city, tucked behind old oak trees and winding roads. The kind of place reserved for people who had lived big lives and wanted a quiet end. Visiting hours were listed clearly. No appointment necessary for guests or volunteers. That word, volunteer, stayed with me. The next morning, I called in sick. I told myself I just wanted to look, to be sure. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. I needed more time, more pieces to this puzzle. I needed to know what I was stepping into. I dressed in something neutral, beige sweater, jeans, a scarf to distract from my anxious fidgeting. I walked through the front doors of North Pines at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, greeted by a kind receptionist who asked if I was there to visit someone. No, I said quickly. I'm thinking of volunteering. I'm just getting a feel for the place. She smiled warmly and handed me a clipboard. We always appreciate helping hands. You're welcome to walk around. Just don't enter private rooms without staff. The halls were bright and quiet. Walls painted in soft tones. Paintings of forests and seascapes hung in polished frames. Residents played cards in the common area or dozed in recliners facing a wall-mounted television. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. I walked slowly, scanning faces, searching for something familiar. And then I saw him. Richard. He was sitting by a window, a blanket across his lap, staring out at a garden where a few autumn leaves still clung to the trees. He looked smaller than I remembered. Friendlier. But it was him. I ducked out of view before he could turn. My heart was hammering again. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I found a staff member in scrubs refilling a cart with juice cups and napkins. Excuse me, I said gently. I'm new, just looking around. Do you know much about Mr. Shaw? She smiled, nodding. Richard? He's quiet, keeps to himself. Used to be a big name in business, you know? Lost touch with his family years ago. Has a daughter who vanished, poor thing. Some say it broke him. I swallowed hard. Does he talk about them? Sometimes. Mostly about a granddaughter he never met. He says her name was Anne. You should hear the way he talks about her, like she's the last missing piece of his life. I thanked her and walked away quickly, afraid she'd see the emotion building behind my eyes. Back in my car, I sat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. Everything she said confirmed it. He wasn't just some old man with a story. He was mine. And I was his. And whether I was ready or not, our stories were no longer separate. For the next several days, I lived in a strange state of half-reality. I still went to work. I still smiled at customers, restocked shelves, counted cash at the end of the day. But inside, I was spiraling. I couldn't stop thinking about Richard, about what he had lost, and what I might have never known if fate hadn't pulled us into the same checkout line that night. And then there were my parents. I had always believed our relationship was solid. They were quiet people, much like me. Loving in a reserved kind of way, rarely dramatic, always consistent. They never spoke much about my adoption. Just vague references, like it had all been handled by a reputable agency and that I was the best thing that had ever happened to them. But I never questioned the lack of detail, until now. One evening after dinner, I brought it up gently. Have either of you ever heard the name Richard Shaw? My mother froze mid-sip of her tea. My father looked at her first before turning to me. Why do you ask? He said carefully. No reason. Just heard it somewhere. I tried to sound casual, but even I didn't buy it. They exchanged another glance, the kind of silent communication that only people with shared secrets can master. Then my mother smiled too quickly and said, "Doesn't ring a bell." That lie landed like a stone in my chest. That night, when they went to bed, I stayed up. Something was clawing at me, urging me toward the attic, a place I hadn't been since childhood. It was cluttered, filled with boxes of forgotten things, dusty books, old Christmas decorations. But I dug and dug until I found something odd. A file folder, tucked behind a crate of baby clothes. Inside were yellowed documents, hospital forms, a birth notice, sealed correspondence, and then a notarized form, folded 3 times. My birth certificate. But it didn't match the one in Richard's envelope. This one listed my mother as unknown. My birth date matched, but the rest felt rewritten. Tucked at the back was a small envelope, never opened. The return address, Richard Shaw. It had been postmarked 22 years ago. I sat down right there on the attic floor and opened it with trembling hands. The letter inside was desperate and sincere. To whomever is raising and, it read. I beg of you, please. I do not wish to interfere, but I need to know she's safe. I need to see her, even if only once. She is my family. She is my everything. There was more, but I couldn't keep reading. The weight of that letter, unopened for decades, was unbearable. They had known. They had known he was looking for me. They had received his plea. And they had hidden it, buried it, just like the truth. The next morning, I ordered a DNA kit online. I didn't tell anyone. I sent it off the same day it arrived, and every day after that became a countdown. I avoided my parents, barely spoke more than necessary. I kept going to work, kept pretending nothing had changed. But it had. Something in me had cracked open. And once you see the shape of your own story, you can't unsee it. When I returned to the attic a few days later, I found more. Faded photographs with names scribbled on the back, Grace, Richard, dates that matched my birth year. Hospital bracelets. Even a torn journal page with the words, Forgive me, Grace, written in my father's handwriting. The silence wasn't just a matter of lost paperwork. It was intentional. The envelope I found in the attic should have been the end of doubt. But instead, it was just the beginning of a deeper fracture, not just in my trust, but in the foundation of everything I had believed about my life. I stared at that unopened letter for hours, thinking about how many times my parents must have looked at it and chosen silence. Chosen to keep me from the truth. Still, I needed more. More than documents, more than instincts. I needed undeniable confirmation. Something final. As the days passed, I became obsessed with the past. I searched through every drawer, every old photo album, every dusty box in our basement. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, another letter, a photo, something that screamed yes, you are who he says you are. What I found instead was tucked inside a plain folder marked medical records. It was thin, no more than a few pages, and at first, it looked routine, vaccine records, pediatric checkups, allergy notes. But sandwiched between those pages was another letter. This one was also from Richard. But this letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed directly to my adoptive parents. It was dated just weeks after my first birthday. The words were meticulous, formal, but aching with urgency. I write again not to threaten or interfere, it began, but to plead for the smallest window of connection. I am Anne's grandfather. I have legal documents to prove it. I do not ask to change her life, only to be a small part of it. Her mother, my daughter Grace, has suffered deeply since the separation. She wants to see and, even from a distance. We are not strangers. We are her family. At the bottom of the page, his signature, Richard Shaw. I dropped the letter in my lap and stared into nothing. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one in the envelope I had found earlier, the same loops in the G, the same slight lean of every word. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a forged plea from someone trying to create a connection where none existed. This was real. They had been given the truth. And they had chosen to bury it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the evidence of a life I hadn't truly lived. My name, my face, my blood, it had all belonged to another world, one I'd been kept from without my consent. When morning came, I called in sick again. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't go sell paperbacks and smile at strangers when my entire sense of self was unraveling. And then I did something I never thought I would do. I drove back to North Pines. I didn't go in. I sat in the car with the engine off, watching the front doors like they might open and give me something, a sign, a push, a moment of courage. I watched a nurse wheel an elderly woman out to the garden. I saw staff members come and go with trays and blankets and clipboards. But I didn't move. Because as much as I needed answers, I knew I wasn't ready to look Richard in the eye and ask the question that was now screaming inside me, why didn't anyone fight harder? Why did they all let me go? Back at home, I opened the drawer where I had hidden the DNA test receipt. It said, results expected in 7 to 10 business days. I had never hated time so much. The envelope, the attic, the records, the silence, all of it had been preparing me for a confrontation I hadn't realized was coming. But nothing prepared me for Margot. It happened on a Wednesday morning, cool and overcast, the kind of Portland day that settles like a sigh over everything. I had decided, finally, to visit Richard properly. No disguises, no volunteer ruse. I walked into North Pines holding both letters in my purse. 100 thoughts in my head and a strange sense of resolve in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew I had to say something. But as I stepped through the automatic doors, I saw her. A woman, tall, in her 50s maybe, dark hair tied back tight, expensive coat draped over her shoulders like it belonged to someone wealthier than she claimed to be. She was standing at the front desk, voice raised just enough to demand attention without shouting. "I'm here to see Richard Shaw," she said. "And I'm not leaving until I speak to whoever's been lying to him." I froze. The receptionist tried to remain calm. "Ma'am, Mr. Shaw has the right to see whomever he chooses." She scoffed. "Not when people are manipulating him. I'm his family. I have legal standing." The receptionist glanced at me, probably recognizing me from earlier visits, but before I could say a word, the woman turned and locked eyes with me. Something in her gaze shifted. Her posture changed. "You," she said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to be menacing. "You're the one pretending to be and, aren't you?" I was stunned. "I'm not pretending anything." "Oh, please," she snapped. "You think you're the first girl to come crawling out of the woodwork hoping for a piece of the estate? You think some old man's confusion is proof of anything? You don't know a thing about our family." "I am his granddaughter," I said, louder than I meant to. She laughed, sharp, cold. "No. You're the daughter of a mistake. My sister was barely out of rehab when she gave birth to you. She didn't want you. She signed the papers herself. You are a problem, not a person." The words hit harder than I expected. But I stood my ground. "Grace was your sister?" She nodded, narrowing her eyes. "Was. She disappeared 20 years ago, and good riddance. Left behind a mess I had to clean up. Richard spent his fortune looking for her. You showing up now, right when he's vulnerable? It's not a coincidence." I took a step closer. "I didn't even know who he was until last week." "Exactly," she hissed. "But suddenly you do. And here you are. With what? A birth certificate? A sob story? It's not going to work. I've spoken to our lawyer. If you try to claim anything, we'll take you to court." The receptionist intervened gently, asking her to lower her voice. Margot took a breath, composing herself. "I want a private conversation with Mr. Shaw. Alone. And I want it on record that this woman is attempting to manipulate him emotionally for financial gain." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from rage. I left the building without saying another word. Outside, the clouds had thickened. I walked until I reached my car, opened the door, and just sat there. Breathing. Processing. Replaying every word. Margot. Aunt. Gatekeeper. Threat. I didn't need her approval. But her presence, and her bitterness, made everything more complicated. Her version of Grace painted a picture I wasn't ready to believe. Addict. Runaway. A woman who had signed the papers without a fight. But that didn't match the woman in the photographs, or the letters Richard had kept. It didn't match the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of her. Still, Margot had power. She had access. She had legal authority and a personal grudge. And she wasn't afraid to use either. Back at home, I laid out everything I had on the kitchen table. The birth certificate. The photos. The letters. And then, as if summoned by some cruel sense of timing, my phone buzzed. The subject line made my stomach twist. Your DNA results are in. I didn't open it. Not yet. I stared at the screen, then at the evidence in front of me. I thought about Margot, about Richard, about Grace. About the possibility that I belonged to all of them, and none of them. I would open the email. But not tonight. First, I needed to decide what kind of truth I was ready to face. The email with my DNA results stayed unopened for nearly a full day. I told myself I needed time, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Because if the results confirmed what I already knew in my bones, then everything about my life, every Sunday dinner, every childhood memory, every quiet moment of trust between me and the people who raised me, would become something else entirely. Not a lie. But not the truth either. And before I could face that confirmation, I needed to hear them say it. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table waiting for them to come home from work. The house felt heavier than usual, like the walls were bracing for something. I had laid the two letters, the one Richard wrote to them, and the unopened DNA email, in the center of the table like evidence in a trial. They walked in together. My father set down his keys. My mother smiled, cautiously. She knew. We need to talk, I said. They sat without protest. My mother folded her hands neatly in front of her. My father leaned back, the way he always did when he didn't want to react too quickly. I slid the letter toward them. You received this 22 years ago. You never told me. My mother looked down. My father didn't. My voice didn't shake. Why? There was a long silence. Then my father finally spoke. We thought we were protecting you. I laughed once, dry, short. From what? The truth? No, my mother said gently. From being torn between two worlds. You were happy. You were safe. We didn't want to confuse you. But it wasn't your choice to make, I said. You knew he was out there. You knew he was looking for me. My father ran a hand over his face. We were scared. We didn't know what he wanted. We thought, maybe he'd try to take you away. He didn't want custody, I snapped. He wanted a letter. A photograph. One moment. And you gave him nothing. Tears were forming in my mother's eyes now. We were wrong, she said quietly. We were wrong, Anne. But we were afraid of losing you. And now? I asked. We already have, my father said, not angrily, just like a fact he couldn't undo. I stood and walked to the window, needing space, air, something beyond their silence. Outside, the neighborhood was still. I could see the porch light flicker on across the street. Somewhere, a dog barked. You could have told me, I said. At any time. We kept waiting for the right moment, my mother said. But there never was one. I turned back to them. There were thousands of moments. You just chose not to use any of them. Neither of them replied. I picked up the laptop from the counter and brought it back to the table. I opened the DNA email and clicked through, the sound of the mouse echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. The result loaded instantly. Match found, Richard Shaw, paternal grandfather. The confirmation sat there, black and white, cold and undeniable. I turned the screen so they could see. No one spoke for a long time. Then, finally, my father reached for the letter again, rereading the words like maybe this time they would excuse him. But they didn't. He wanted to be part of my life, I said. And you stopped him. We loved you, my mother whispered. I never said you didn't. But love, I realized, could coexist with fear. And fear had ruled their choices, choices that were no longer theirs to defend. I gathered the papers and laptop, sliding them back into my bag. I need space, I said. They didn't argue. My mother nodded, eyes full of quiet regret. My father didn't move. That night, I packed a small suitcase and checked into a hotel across town. The room was small and impersonal, but it gave me the distance I needed. From them. From who I had been. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Richard was my grandfather. That was no longer a question. Now came the harder part, deciding what I wanted to do with the truth. The hotel room became my refuge, sterile, quiet, detached from the noise of the life I had just stepped away from. For 2 days, I didn't call anyone. I walked through the city with no destination, watched people I didn't know living lives untouched by the kind of upheaval that had rearranged mine. I answered no messages. I avoided the bookstore. I ignored every call from my parents. But there was one place I couldn't avoid any longer. Richard deserved to know. I returned to North Pines on a gray Friday morning. This time, I didn't hesitate. I asked to see him. I didn't pretend to be anyone else. The receptionist smiled as if she had been waiting for me to finally say the truth out loud. When I entered his room, Richard was seated near the window again, his hands folded, a blanket across his knees. He looked up slowly, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition. A spark of something fragile and bright. "You came back," he said softly. I did. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit. Please." I did. My heart was beating so loud I was sure he could hear it. "I received my DNA results," I said. His eyes didn't leave mine. "You're my granddaughter," he said before I could finish. I nodded. He took a breath, closed his eyes briefly. "I knew it." "I didn't," I admitted. "Not until now." He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "I've imagined this moment for 23 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, I wondered where you were. If you were safe. If you knew you were loved." I felt a lump rise in my throat. I didn't know anything. Until that day in the market. He smiled faintly. "I almost didn't speak to you. I thought maybe I was seeing things. But then, you looked at me. And I knew." I reached into my bag and pulled out the letter he had written to my adoptive parents, handing it to him gently. They never opened it. I found it hidden away. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers trembling. "I wrote so many," he said. "Most never sent. Some never answered." I started to believe it was better not to hope. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "No," he said firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for." For a long time, we sat in silence, surrounded by the quiet hum of the nursing home. I looked around the room, the sparse furniture, the books on the shelf, the faded photo of a woman I now knew was Grace. She had my eyes. Or maybe I had hers. "I want to know her," I said. "She was troubled," he replied, not unkindly. "But she was brilliant. And she loved you. In her own way." I nodded. "Margot said she signed the papers willingly." He flinched. "Margot always had her own narrative. She hated what Grace had become. But Grace didn't abandon you. She was coerced. Threatened with being declared unfit. I offered to raise you myself, but the agency wouldn't hear of it. They believed you'd do better with strangers. She said some ugly things about me," I admitted. "Margot. She accused me of pretending to be your heir." Richard's expression hardened. "She wants the estate. She always has. She sees you as a threat, not as family." I hesitated. "Are you going to fight her?" He looked at me carefully. "Only if I have to." That night, the story broke in the local press. A headline, "Lost Heiress of Portland Tycoon Found After 2 Decades." My name was in the article. So was his. Photos of Richard as a young businessman. A side-by-side of my face and Grace's. Calls came quickly. Reporters. Distant relatives. Curious strangers. But Margot was faster. She filed an injunction within 48 hours, claiming the DNA test was inconclusive, alleging emotional manipulation, and requesting a formal investigation into the inheritance. Her lawyers demanded I be barred from making any financial claims until a court ruled on my identity. I wasn't surprised. Richard was livid. She wants to make this ugly, he said. But we won't let her. We have the truth. But truth and law weren't always the same. And now, I had to prove that what we had wasn't just a story, it was fact. It was family. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. In that time, everything changed. I moved out of the hotel and into a temporary apartment downtown, a place with bare walls and borrowed furniture that felt more mine than my childhood bedroom ever had. I visited Richard almost every day, and we spoke for hours. He told me about his years in business, the house where Grace grew up, the day she disappeared without warning. She was 26, he said, eyes on the window. She had just started painting again. I thought she was getting better. Then, one morning, she was gone. I asked if he ever tried to find her. He laughed, not with humor. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying. Private investigators. Missing persons reports. Dead leads. Some said she joined a commune. Others claimed she'd overdosed and her body was never found. I never stopped looking, even when everyone else told me to. I asked him if he ever believed she was still alive. I still do, he said quietly. At first, I dismissed that as the wishful thinking of a grieving father. But then he handed me a file, something he had kept in a locked drawer for over a decade. It was filled with notes, letters, and photographs, some in color, some black and white, all labeled meticulously in his neat handwriting. Grace, age 17. Grace in rehab. Grace in an art studio. Then a letter, and signed, no return address, postmarked from Astoria, Oregon, dated 4 years after my birth. It read, I'm sorry. I think about her every day. I hope she's happy. I'm not ready to be found. No name. No explanation. Just that. He believed it was from Grace. He had shown it to handwriting experts. One confirmed it matched other samples from her journals. But that wasn't the most shocking part. At the bottom of the file was a grainy surveillance photo from a gas station outside Eugene. Dated 8 years ago. A woman standing beside a payphone, partially turned away. Dark hair. Slender. Eyes hidden by sunglasses. But the resemblance was chilling. It's her, he said. I know it's her. And suddenly, I wasn't so sure she was gone either. I brought the letter and the photo back to my apartment, staring at them for hours. The idea of her being out there, alive, watching from afar, never stepping forward, was overwhelming. Had she regretted giving me up? Had she felt ashamed? Or had she been kept away, the same way I had been kept from Richard? At the same time, the legal battle with Margot intensified. Her legal team requested every detail of my life. Adoption papers. School records. The DNA report was picked apart, challenged, reinterpreted. They claimed Richard was vulnerable. That I had preyed on his grief. That I had somehow manipulated the narrative for gain. I had no choice but to prepare for court. My lawyer, a sharp, composed woman named Evelyn Park, advised me to keep everything focused on facts. Do not talk about love. Do not talk about hope. Talk about biology, paperwork, the letter, the DNA. They want emotion. You give them evidence. Richard wanted to testify. I begged him not to. You don't owe them anything, I said. But I owe you everything, he replied. We compromised, he would write a statement to be read in court. A week before the hearing, I received an anonymous envelope at my apartment. No name. No return address. Inside was a photograph. A woman, early 40s, pale eyes, standing in front of a mural in some small coastal town. She was older. Weathered. But I recognized her immediately. It was Grace. On the back of the photo, scribbled in pen, "You're getting close." I sat down on the floor, the photo in my lap, unable to speak, unable to breathe. My fingers trembled. She was alive. Somewhere, she was alive. But who had sent the photo? And why now? Richard was ecstatic. She knows, he said. She's watching. She's waiting. But it raised more questions than it answered. If she was alive, why hadn't she come back? If she knew about me, why didn't she reach out? Unless she couldn't. Or someone didn't want her to. The courthouse loomed large and indifferent against the rainy Portland morning. I arrived early, dressed in muted tones, my hair pulled back tightly, not because I cared about appearance, but because it gave me something to control. Evelyn met me at the steps, holding a folder close to her chest, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Today is not about what they believe, she said. It's about what we can prove. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I expected, not just physically, but emotionally. Margot sat at the opposite end with her team, dressed in dark navy, her posture stiff, her eyes darting toward me every few seconds like she was watching for a slip, a crack, a weakness. I didn't give her one. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for precision and zero tolerance for theatrics, opened the session briskly. The court clerk read the case aloud, Shaw versus Shaw, et al., dispute of inheritance, familial legitimacy, and intent. Margot's lawyers went first. They painted a picture of manipulation, a young woman with nothing, walking into the life of a vulnerable man for gain. They referenced the sudden media coverage, the timing of my appearance, the supposed emotional instability of Richard Shaw. They argued the DNA test could not alone confirm intent or relationship. They insinuated that I had sought out the connection after discovering his fortune. Evelyn let them speak. She didn't interrupt. Didn't flinch. Then it was our turn. Evelyn stood, calm, her voice clear. She laid out the facts, adoption records, birth certificate inconsistencies, sealed letters, photographic evidence, and the DNA report confirming biological linkage to Richard. She presented Richard's notarized statement, where he described his lifelong search for me, his certainty from the moment we met, and his unwavering belief in my identity. Then she asked if I wanted to speak. I did. I stood slowly, holding nothing in my hands, facing the courtroom without notes or rehearsal. My name is and I began. For 23 years, I didn't know where I came from. I accepted the story given to me because it was all I had. Then a man in a grocery store said a name I didn't recognize, not at first. But something inside me did. I paused, letting the silence settle. I didn't come here for money. I didn't even know who Richard Shaw was until I stumbled into him. What I found wasn't a fortune, it was a history. A truth I had been denied my entire life. Margot shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I don't need his inheritance. I've lived without it all this time. What I needed was a name. A connection. And now I have it. The DNA doesn't lie. The documents don't lie. The silence around my past, that was the lie. When I sat down, Evelyn placed her hand briefly over mine. No smile. Just solidarity. Margot's lawyers made one final push, accusing us of fabricating emotion, manipulating a narrative, even suggesting the letter found in my attic could have been planted. But there was no weight behind their desperation. The judge called a brief recess. Outside in the hallway, Richard waited in a wheelchair, escorted by a nurse. When he saw me, he held out his hand. I'm proud of you, he said. Margot passed us minutes later, her jaw clenched, her eyes cold. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. The defeat had already begun to settle around her like a shadow. When the court resumed, the judge was direct. I've reviewed the evidence. The documentation provided by the petitioner is thorough. The DNA test shows a 99.9% match to Mr. Richard Shaw. The historical records confirm inconsistencies in the adopted parents' documentation. And the court finds no credible proof of deceit or manipulation by the respondent, Miss and Shaw. She looked over her glasses. Until this court is presented with contrary, verified evidence, and Shaw shall be recognized as the biological granddaughter of Richard Shaw, with full legal rights therein, including status as next of kin and heir presumptive. I didn't react. I couldn't. The words landed like stones on calm water, heavy, final, but oddly still. Outside the courtroom, the press waited. I said nothing. Evelyn gave a short statement. This is not a story about money. It's about identity. About truth. And about a family fractured by silence finally starting to speak. That night, I returned to Richard's room. He was quiet at first, then reached for the photo I now carried everywhere, the one of Grace in front of the mural. She'd be proud of you, he said. I hope she knows. She knows, he said, with that same quiet certainty he had from the very beginning. The trial had ended, but the story didn't feel finished. The truth had been confirmed in the eyes of the law, but that didn't bring peace, not entirely. I had a name now. I had a past that no longer belonged only to shadows and whispers. Yet the most important piece of that puzzle, my mother Grace, remained elusive. Her photograph stayed on my desk, beside the unopened envelope with the payphone picture and the typed letter Richard had always believed came from her. I stared at them nightly, willing them to offer more. A clue. A trail. A voice. But they remained silent. That silence finally broke on a Monday morning when Evelyn called. There's someone you need to meet, she said. He used to work for Richard. Long time ago. Said he found something in the basement of the old Shaw office downtown. What kind of something? Boxes. Files. Apparently, Grace's. He said it never made it to storage because Richard couldn't bring himself to throw it out. 2 hours later, I stood in a narrow elevator as it rattled down to the basement level of what had once been Shaw Real Estate's headquarters. The building now belonged to another company, but the lower levels had remained untouched. Forgotten. Waiting. The man waiting for me introduced himself as Glenn. Late 60s, with oil-stained hands and tired eyes. I was in maintenance, he said. Worked here 25 years. I saw her, Grace, back when she used to come by. Strange girl. Quiet. Beautiful. Left things behind after she stopped showing up. He led me to a storage cage near the far wall. Inside were 4 boxes, sealed and labeled only with the initials GS. Take your time, he said, then left me alone. I sat on the concrete floor and opened the first box. Paint tubes. Sketchbooks. Half-finished portraits. Grace had been an artist, something Richard had mentioned but never elaborated on. Her sketches were raw, emotional, images of crying women, sleeping children, dark landscapes filled with silhouettes that looked like they were walking away from the viewer, always leaving. The second box was filled with notebooks. Dozens. Most were dated, each entry like a letter never sent. And didn't cry when I left her. That was the worst part. She just stared up at me, like she knew. I'm not sure if I'm the kind of person who should be a mother. But I miss her more than anything I've ever missed. Sometimes I wonder if my father will forgive me. But then I remember I didn't leave him. I left everything. The third box stopped me cold. Inside was a legal envelope. Unsealed. Inside, a will, handwritten, witnessed, and dated 2 months before she vanished. I, Grace Elaine Shaw, being of sound mind, do hereby state my wish that should anything happen to me, my daughter and Grace Shaw be entrusted solely to the care of my father, Richard Shaw. My hands began to shake. It was notarized. Signed. Stamped. She had wanted me with him. Not strangers. Not a closed adoption. Him. And someone had ignored it. At the bottom of the box, I found a worn leather folder. Inside were pages torn from another journal, darker, more frantic. Mentions of a man she feared. A social worker she no longer trusted. Of threats. Coercion. One entry stood out. They said if I didn't agree to adoption, they'd declare me unfit. That they'd take her anyway. I had no money. No help. They told me Dad was too old, too public, too unstable. I pressed the pages to my chest, feeling something inside me break open, not from pain, but from understanding. She hadn't abandoned me. She had tried to fight. She had wanted me. All along. I took the boxes back to Richard the next morning. He read every line in silence, tears slipping down his cheeks. She wrote this, he said, holding the will. She made this choice. And they buried it. It's not too late, I said. He looked at me, something fierce behind the grief. No. It's not. We contacted Evelyn. She filed the will immediately with the court. It would bolster our case beyond inheritance. It was now about legacy. Legitimacy. It proved that Grace had never intended for me to be lost. And it could change everything. But more than that, it gave me something I had never had before. A voice. Her voice. Whispering across time and silence, telling me I was never unwanted. The filing of Grace's will sent quiet ripples through every layer of the legal storm surrounding my identity. No longer was it just about DNA or Richard's belief, it was about my mother's intent, her documented voice, her final plea to a world that had ignored her. The court accepted the document as legitimate, and with that, the last arguments from Margot's legal team began to unravel. The judge issued a formal declaration: I was the rightful heir to Grace's estate and to Richard's by lineage and designation. No further opposition from Margot would be considered without new evidence. Her last attempt, a motion to delay the decision pending a psychological evaluation of Richard, was swiftly denied. The gavel fell like the final heartbeat of a long, aching silence. I walked out of the courthouse without speaking to the press. Reporters flanked the steps, cameras flashing, voices calling my name. But I didn't need their questions. I didn't need their headlines. I had what I came for. At Richard's request, we spent the evening quietly, back in his room at North Pines. We sat by the window while the sky outside turned gold and then blue. He had grown frailier in the past few weeks, his voice softer, but his presence had never felt more solid. She would have been proud, he said. I nodded. I know. I think she's watching. He smiled. That photo you found, of her in front of the mural. I recognized the artwork. It's from a small town near the coast. Grace used to visit it when she was younger. Maybe that's where she went. I want to find her, I said, not as a question, but as a promise. He didn't respond, just squeezed my hand gently. Days later, I moved into a new place, a modest house on the west side of Portland, nestled on a quiet street with trees that arched overhead like old sentinels. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a mansion. But it was mine. Part of the inheritance was released shortly after the final ruling. Richard, against my initial protests, insisted I accept it. I sat for hours reviewing the finances, overwhelmed by numbers that didn't feel real, accounts, assets, holdings tied to the name I now carried. But I knew I couldn't keep it all. So I started making decisions. I set aside a portion, enough to live comfortably, to build a future. The rest I began to donate. Quietly. Purposefully. Organizations that supported adoption transparency. Programs that offered legal aid to women at risk of losing their children. Mental health clinics for young mothers. Funds for artists who, like Grace, might have voices that no one ever listened to. The media twisted it into a redemption arc. Lost Heir gives back millions. I didn't care. This wasn't about redemption. It was about repair. Rebuilding. Richard and I spent more time together than ever before. He told me stories of Grace that weren't about her addiction or her disappearance, but about her laugh. Her stubbornness. How she once ran out of a wedding because the centerpieces weren't symmetrical. How she wrote poetry in the margins of her textbooks. How, even in her darkest moments, she never stopped drawing. She was fire, he said once. And no one ever knew how to hold her without getting burned. I understood now. I saw her not just as the ghost who had vanished, but as a woman caught between systems, silences, and impossible choices. I carried her name. Her eyes. Her weight. And now, her story. Every night, I would sit at my desk, the boxes from the basement still stacked nearby, and read through her journals. There were still pages I hadn't touched. Still sketches I hadn't interpreted. Still corners of her life left in shadow. But I no longer feared the unknown. Because I was walking into it with clarity, with her voice guiding me. The last thing Richard asked of me before I left one evening was simple. Take the name. Make it mean something again. And I did. I legally reinstated my full name and Grace Shaw. In one signature, I became whole. It was a Sunday afternoon when I finally returned to the house where Grace grew up. Richard had made arrangements for me to visit the property, now owned by a trust but left untouched, preserved like a memory sealed in glass. The house stood on a quiet street just outside Portland, a two-story colonial with white shutters and a red door that had faded to rust. Ivy climbed the sides like time trying to reclaim it. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, dust, and something faintly floral. A caretaker handed me the keys and left me alone. I walked room by room, touching the walls, the furniture, the light switches, all the small details that had once shaped her childhood. The living room was filled with old books. A record player rested in a corner. The kitchen had a chalkboard still bearing a half-erased message in cursive, "Don't forget milk." Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under my steps. Her bedroom was as she had left it. Posters from the 80s, dried-out pens in jars, notebooks scattered on a desk. The bed was unmade, the pillow dented as if she had just left. I opened drawers carefully, reverently, as though touching the past might somehow wake it up. And then I found it. Behind the dresser, wedged between the wall and the floorboard, was a small journal bound in faded leather. It was hidden deliberately, not placed, but buried. I sat cross-legged on the carpet and opened it, the pages crackling under my fingertips. The first entries were short sketches. Half-formed thoughts. Still feel like I'm being watched. Maybe that's what it means to be a mother, to always think someone's eyes are on you. And was quiet today. I wonder if babies feel absence. If they know when their future is being decided without them. The entries grew longer. More detailed. She described her fear. Her loneliness. The cold bureaucracy of adoption meetings. Social workers who smiled with closed eyes. Agencies that promised happy endings while silencing dissent. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear. And eventually, she did. The final entries were letters. Not addressed to anyone official. They were all for me. And I don't know where you'll be when you read this. Or if you'll ever see it. But I need you to know something, I never wanted to let you go. I was 26. Alone. Terrified. And everyone around me said I wasn't enough. But they were wrong. You were enough. You were always enough. If you find this, it means you searched. It means you didn't forget me, even though they tried to make sure you would. I love you. Even now. Even if I never see you again. I couldn't read the last page right away. I closed the journal, held it against my chest, and let the weight of her words settle into me. She had written to me, across decades, across absence, across the silence that had wrapped our lives in confusion and pain. She had never stopped speaking. I spent the rest of the afternoon in that room, reading every page slowly. Crying sometimes. Laughing when she described how I once sneezed and scared myself into tears. It was all there, the mother I never knew, the love I always wondered about, the connection they told me never existed. When I left the house that evening, I took the journal with me. I returned to Richard's room and placed it gently in his hands. She never stopped writing, I said. He opened the first page with trembling fingers. His eyes, dimmed by age and fatigue, brightened with tears. I thought I lost her, he whispered. But she was always trying to come home. We sat in silence, reading together. Later that night, I walked alone through downtown, the city lights reflecting in puddles along the sidewalk. I thought about how much had changed. How much had been uncovered. And how much still remained just out of reach. But I no longer felt lost. My name was in Grace Shaw. I was the granddaughter of a man who never stopped searching. The daughter of a woman who never stopped loving. And the story of who I was, who I am, no longer began in a grocery store aisle. It began long before that. But it was there, in that unexpected moment, when I finally started to find my way back.